Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Lecture 7, Anthropology and Visual Media. Scholars who have contributed to anthropological studies on cinema are not very high in number, but cinema has been studied in anthropology since the 1950s. If we take Hortense Powdermaker's study as the starting point, she looked at Hollywood. And more recently, another American anthropologist, Sherry Ortner, has looked at independent cinema in America. More closer to home, we have more studies by anthropologists on cinema. Tejaswini Ganti has done a very clear and lucid thorough study of Bollywood, and Sarah Dickey, Roos Gerritsen and Anand Pandian have all studied Tamil cinema from an anthropological perspective. Now, some of these scholars have looked at the production side of filmmaking, while others have looked at the audience perspective. So, there is a variation in methodology here between studying the elite, the more powerful, the big studios, film stars, producers and directors, as opposed to studying ordinary people who are viewers or fans. So, there are different methodologies that are required in these two different settings. Broadly, most of the studies have concentrated on issues of identity, identity of class, caste, regional, linguistic identity, the link between the kind of messages that go out through films and national identity, identity about gender. All these issues have come to the fore through these studies on anthropological studies on cinema. Of course, here also many scholars from other disciplines have looked at cinema, which are useful for us to consider. For example, from sociology, history and cultural studies for one, they all offer a lot for us to understand about cinema, particularly in India. Some scholars who are very well known for their expertise on cinema include M.K. Raghavendra, Madhava Prasad, Theodore Bhaskaran, M.S.S. Pandian, Rachel Dwyer, Patricia Uberoy. All of them have thrown light on what cinema can tell us if we look at it from an ethnographic perspective and historical perspective and from a theoretical perspective. So, some parts of cinema, Indian cinema from some parts of India are more well studied than other parts of India. For example, there is a lot of literature on Bollywood. Like I said, there are good works on Tamil cinema, Telugu cinema, and Bengali cinema, for example. We have fewer works on, say, Kannada cinema or any other languages which are where the number of cinema movies produced are not so high in number. So, obviously, there is still a lot more work to be done in evolving a kind of large understanding of cinema across different parts of India. Bhojpuri cinema is now beginning to become a very important category of analysis in understanding Hindi cinema, because oftentimes people confuse between Hindi cinema and Bollywood. It is important to remember that not all of Hindi cinema is produced only in Bollywood. There is a lot of Hindi cinema that is produced outside of Bollywood, and Bhojpuri cinema is one example. and that has now come under rigorous analysis by research scholars, and we will be looking at more information from these studies, which can tell us a lot about, say, regional linguistic and regional identity formation. But what do these studies, which have been established for some time, tell us about cinema? What new light can anthropology throw on the understanding of cinema? One thing we know is cinema is not just about the number of films produced or the box office earnings. Cinema is also about the process of filmmaking itself, and how cultural notions and practices inherently involve themselves in this process of filmmaking. Because at the end of the day, films are produced by people and are seen by people. So therefore, it is of interest to anthropologists to investigate this both from the producer's perspective as well as from the viewer's perspective. Let us start with the first comprehensive study of cinema, which was done by Hortense Powdermaker, and her book is titled Hollywood Dream Factory. What are the main arguments in this book? Powdermaker was a student of Malinowski, who studied anthropology at the London School of Economics, and then went on to do several other studies before she embarked on her study of Hollywood in 1946-1947. So we are talking about a study which took place nearly 70 years ago, and it is still very rare for anthropologists to look at media. It was extremely unusual for an anthropologist to be looking at media. What was Hortense Powdermaker's interest? Why did she want to look at this Hollywood? She looked at Hollywood as a system which, if studied, can throw light on some aspect of American culture. She saw Hollywood as located in American culture, and by looking at Hollywood as a society in itself, or as she calls it, a system, she calls it a system. So it has its own rules, its own regulations, its own rituals, superstitions. So by looking at Hollywood as one would look at any other system, she was trying to deduce whether that can tell us something more about American culture, by which she already makes a point that filmmaking is not something that happens in a vacuum, somewhere outside, somewhere totally separated from the society where the stories are emerging. She clearly locates it right in the American society itself, the American society of the 1940s, early 50s, and trying to understand what can this tell us from an anthropological perspective. So very unusual for her to have engaged with this research. She immediately, if you read her book very early on, she makes the point that she sees Hollywood as manipulative as any other system of mass communication will be assumed to be. That was the thought at that period of time, that these kind of large industries are manipulative, and they can make the audience see things that otherwise the audience will not see. And it was a kind of a negative attitude that was taken towards media. While Powdermaker also says that in the very beginning of her book, she also she does not say that I give the audience more agency. She doesn't say that, at least at the beginning. But what she also tries to do is to see what role can this movie going be fulfilling in an individual's life. Why would people want to go to movies? What does it give them in return? And she argues that it is a form of escape. So, escapism as a notion that we know very well now starts emerging from this point, that movie going as a form of escapism. So, she says that it gives people a form of escape from their everyday life. It also gives some kind of vicarious pleasure for ordinary people to see other ordinary people on screen, take on the big guys, so to speak, and defeat them and overpower them and emerge successful, which is not possible for most people in their everyday lives, and therefore seeing this play out on screen gives them some kind of vicarious pleasure. And to see some of the problems resolved, at least on screen, if not in their real lives. She concludes that these are the reasons why people actually go and watch films. Another tension that she picks out in her study is about whether making movies should be a business, or is it an endeavor of art? Is it about creativity? Is it about passion? And again she places this not only within Hollywood, but she says this is a larger tension in American society itself, the tension between pursuit of capitalism versus pursuit of more aesthetic, otherworldly kind of endeavors. So she says this is not something very unique to Hollywood. We cannot only blame Hollywood for having to deal with this issue. This is much beyond just Hollywood. Another, so she makes a lot of such points in her work. So just to give an example, she looks at, in one of her chapters, she looks very closely at the producers of movies. Producers as in the production process itself, and there are four main people that she identifies. One is the producer, the person or persons who finance the movie. In some cases it can be a big studio, a director, the main actor and writer. And she talks about how some of these stakeholders have closer relationships with one person more than another. For example, the writer may be more engaged with the producer, whereas the actor would be more involved with the director. So these kind of relationships are also explored, but she looks very thoroughly at the kind of issues that go on from the production point of view. So one of the things that filmmakers were grasping with then, and filmmakers are grasping with even now, is how to make a successful film, how to make a film that will become successful. And obviously there is no easy answer to it. And one of the things they used to do in the 1940s in Hollywood, it seems, was to do surveys amongst the audience and find out how they liked this plot versus another, and then see whether the successful plot can then be mass produced, something like an assembly line. But obviously it does not work that way at all, because she takes up the big hit films of that period in 1947-48 when she was studying Hollywood very thoroughly, and she says the topics varied. There was a lot of difference between successful movies, and no one could predict that because this movie or this theme was successful in 1947, the same theme told in a slightly different manner might be successful in 1948. It was very hard to tell. And so the producers were grappling with this issue significantly. And so on the one hand there is a great interest in formula, producing uniformity, but on the other hand producing a film is not like manufacturing a car. You cannot mass produce a film in the same way that one can mass produce a motor vehicle. So obviously this problem between uniformity and originality was at the very center of Hollywood when she was studying this system, as it were, in the 1940s. What we also learn, and what is of interest to anthropology students, is her method. Again, like I said, it is very unusual for someone at that period of time to have gone and studied Hollywood from an anthropological perspective. How did she do it? So one thing was that Hortense Powdermaker spent about 1 year in Hollywood from 1946 to 1947. So she lived in Los Angeles. She attended a lot of film shootings. She met a lot of people. She says that she conducted some 300 interviews. Which is remarkable for an anthropologist to do in about a year. And of course, one problem that anthropologists often encounter is questions about sample size. And Powdermaker discusses this at some length in her work, and she says that she did what she could, in the sense that she made sure that though her sample did not stick to a particular number, that it was representative, that it represented all those people who constitute what is called as Hollywood. So there were enough writers that she spoke to, enough producers, enough directors and actors and camera persons, so that at the end of a year she could get a fair sense of what the world of Hollywood is like. She also talks about the difficulty of taking a quote unquote neutral perspective and being just an observer, and at the same time she emphasizes the importance of not being overwhelmed by talking to people who are very popular in real life, and also it helped her that she was there not to look for a chance in a movie. So people were willing to talk to her and tell her many things. And this work is also very important in terms of methodology for students of anthropology and sociology to understand about how does one go about studying these kind of worlds which will require more attention to looking at the elite people. So even though her work is more than 70 years old and dated, therefore it is extremely important for us to look at what we can learn from Hortense Powdermaker's pioneering study into the film industry. I would next like to talk about one scholar's work, because it is very close to Powdermaker's work, except that it is separated by more than 60 years and thousands of miles. And this is the work Producing Bollywood by Tejaswini Ganti, who is a scholar of Indian origin now teaching at NYU in the United States. Tejaswini Ganti has more than nearly 2 decades of research in Bombay, in Mumbai, into the world of Bollywood, and her work Producing Bollywood looks at the world of Bollywood and nearly looking at the same issues like that of a Powdermaker into, for example, what constitutes a good film, a successful film. How does one arrive there? What kinds of stakeholders are invested in the creative endeavor in Bollywood? So Tejaswini Ganti's study nicely complements what Hortense Powdermaker did nearly 6 decades before her. And so Producing Bollywood was published in 2012, and in this work as well, like Powder Maker, Ganti also looks at the producers, and by this she means all those people who are involved in making a film. She calls them filmmakers, and she talks about sentiments of disdain, as she calls it, and practices of distinction, which is very crucial for people to organize themselves in Bollywood, not just in terms of genres, but also in terms of how they view the world of Bollywood itself. And this is a very important point to understand. So, all those people who are in the filmmaking industry are there to make films, which is like Powder Maker said, at the end of the day is essentially about storytelling. How do you tell a good story? But amongst the filmmakers that Ganti spoke to, there was a very clear delineation between the kind of people that make good films, i.e. the ones who have passion for movies, as opposed to those who come into the filmmaking world with money and just want to make some movies. So everyone segregated everybody else as belonged to this other camp, that is the one which did not have creativity or passion at its heart and wanted to make films for the sake of commercial success. So the same point that Powder Maker talked about, is it business or is it art? What is filmmaking essentially about? And one of the other problems that Bollywood filmmakers face, as did Hollywood filmmakers, is also understanding the audience. That also is one big puzzle for them, and of course India is much more heterogeneous than the American Hollywood market is, in the sense that there are so many languages, so many kinds of themes that are possible in filmmaking. Some topics which might work more in what is called South market may not work in, say, the Hindi speaking belt, and vice versa. So understanding the audience is a big puzzle for filmmakers, even those with long experience in cinema. And audience is also categorized. So she talks about what she calls as audience imaginaries, how the audience is imagined. So some are made for the urban market, now increasingly called the multiplex audience. Some are focused more on the mass audience. So there is a lot of discussion about class versus the mass audience, and how a movie X did not click because the mass audience did not get it, or something like that. And also there are differences made between urban versus rural audience, family audience. For example, the audience for movies like Hum Aapke Hai Kaun versus other kinds of films. Youth is one audience category. So there are various segregations which the filmmakers engage as an exercise in order to figure out how to get that hit which can be possible if only you understood the audience right. So the same kind of desire to find that elusive formula exists in Bollywood as well, except that that formula is very elusive. And therefore filmmakers sometimes just give up and say, who understands the audience? None of us do really, because even the very long established successful actors and directors sometimes fail to guess whether a particular subject will work or not. And it may not necessarily be only about the subject, it could be about how the film was packaged or who are the actors. There are so many factors that go into consideration, and filmmakers do think about it. Another thing that Gunty's research and Powdermaker's research tell us, one commonality between these two studies which took place, remember, one is from the 1940s and the other one is from 1990s, early decade of the millennium, and yet there are a lot of things that are common to both these very in-depth, very rich, thorough studies, and that is that one needs very solid knowledge of the field. And in Gunty's case, it came with a lot more time in that area as opposed to Powdermaker's, but what we do realize is that the sort of ethnographic method that they both employed served very well in bringing out these kind of small, intricate, intimate details of how filmmakers talk about themselves. How do they talk about the world in which they operate, Hollywood or Bollywood? And this can be possible only through this kind of long, in-depth, intricate research that they both engaged in. They built rapport, made connections across stakeholders, they spent long time in their field sites. All these things are very important. There is no shortcut here, and also looking at the films produced as texts will not tell us this information. This has to come and can come only through these methods alone. So, looking at films as texts can tell us many things, but they cannot give us a true insight into what the world of films is really like. And we are enriched by these kind of methodologies that Gunty and Powdermaker have employed to tell us more about the world from which these movies are made. Before Gunty, the person whose work kind of provided an entry point, so to speak, for anthropologists to look at cinema in India would be, one of the scholars would be Sarah Dickey. Sarah Dickey's work, published in the 1990s, looks at Tamil cinema, and she worked in the city of Madurai, which is south of Chennai, about 500 kilometers from Chennai. One of the most ancient cities in Tamil Nadu, with a long tradition of Tamil scholarship, and she looked at the fans and fan clubs of this film star turned politician called M.G. Ramachandran, or popularly known as MGR. And Tamil Nadu is a very interesting case because of a very close relationship between cinema and politics, which is not always the case with Bollywood, for example, or at least with electoral politics. Several chief ministers of Tamil Nadu have emerged with strong links to the world of cinema. Just to name, apart from MGR, Mr. Karunanidhi and Ms. Jayalalitha, who also have had very strong links to the world of cinema. There have been many scholarly works written about this relationship between cinema and politics from various disciplines, and I do not want to go into that here. I want to focus more on what an anthropological approach to films can tell us, and what does Sarah Dickey's work tell us. So, her focus is on cinema and the urban poor. So, a lot of the fans of these film stars were not from middle class backgrounds or elite backgrounds, but from more working class, economically poorer backgrounds. So, she wanted to look at why would they be fans, and why would they do what they do as fans? What is it that is there for them? And from her work we come to know that people or mostly men that she spoke to were attracted to the films of MGR because of a particular kind of depiction of machismo, if you like, which they called Veeram. Now, Veeram or bravery is an attitude, is an aspect which is seen to be very essential for a Tamil male, and the idea was that MGR in his films exemplified that quality very well. In fact, one of his films is even called Madurai Veeran, you know, the brave the brave man of Madurai. So, by these portrayals of characters in his films, which are apart from many other things, you know, being chivalrous and being strong and all of that, this quality of Veeram also imbued in the actor a larger than life persona, which was then transmitted to the fan clubs via the fans, and some scholars argue that this provided a backdrop for the actor when he entered the political arena much later. MGR started acting in films nearly 3 decades before he became chief minister. But even so, throughout his acting career, there was a direct engagement with cinema, but more than just the actor himself or herself. You know, the role of fans and fan clubs are well brought out in Sarah Dickey's work. Another activity, for example, that these fans and fan clubs engaged in, particularly during actors' birthdays. People who are from Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh will be more familiar with this. There will be a lot of blood donation camps, feeding of the poor, you know, donation of clothes to the poor. Lot of charitable activities are undertaken in the name of the actor by the fans through the fan clubs. And these kind of activities also help establish the actor as not just an actor, but much more than that. And this is something that Sarah Dickey, this is something that Sarah Dickey brings out in her work. Much later, many years later, in a similar vein, Roos Gerritsen, a Dutch anthropologist, undertakes a similar study among fans of Rajinikanth, the actor Rajinikanth in Chennai. And Roos Gerritsen writes in this beautiful article titled Cine Addictions, published in 2008, where she coins the term corpothetics. You know, the kind of strong identification between the corporeal, the body, and aesthetics, to fuse the connection between the film and the star. So, in that article she looks at the kinds of pictures and hoardings that fans take out, where their identity and the star's identity is all so mixed up that it is very evident what role this actor occupies in the fans' lives. And again proof of the very close relationship between films and fans, and later on perhaps even with politics, electoral politics. So these studies have also, similar studies have also been undertaken in Andhra Pradesh, for example. This condition, this kind of historical links to social movements and the links between stars and writers and films and fan clubs does not easily translate into every other cinema world in India. However, it is interesting what an anthropological research can throw highlight upon as to exactly how these relationships plan out. You know, what kinds of pathways they take. A lot of it probably not necessarily strategic for the fans at least, but how do they really play out, and what can this tell us about both cinema and politics. So these are some of the things that become very evident from anthropological research on cinema, just one part of visual culture.